Outside a small courthouse in Santa Maria, California, a forest of cameras turned the sidewalk into a permanent red carpet. News anchors spoke in urgent tones, pundits traded predictions, and every movement from one man, Michael Jackson, was dissected worldwide. It was 2005, and one of the most watched criminal cases in history was unfolding. But inside that wood-paneled courtroom, 12 ordinary citizens were watching a very different story. No commercial breaks. No dramatic music. No edited highlights. Just long days of testimony, cross-examinations, contradictions, and evidence that most of the public would never fully hear. On television, the narrative felt simple. A fallen superstar finally facing justice for horrifying accusations. Headlines screamed guilt or innocence before a single witness had finished a sentence. Talk shows turned the case into a morality play. But the jury wasn't watching a show. They were trapped in something far less neat, the uneasy space where memory, motive, fear, and doubt collide. They saw an accuser whose story shifted over time. A family with a complicated past that didn't fit into tidy sound bites. They watched lawyers challenge timelines that many viewers already assumed were established fact. They saw key witnesses falter under pressure, and others unexpectedly strengthen the defense's version of events. They watched some of the prosecution's most hyped points quietly lose force when examined in detail. And when the verdict finally came back, not guilty on every single count, millions were stunned. How could a jury sitting at the very center of the story see it so differently from a world that had been following every update? What did they witness hour after hour that never made it into the nightly news packages or front-page recaps? This is the story of that gap. In this documentary, we're going back into that 2005 courtroom, not as tabloid spectators, but as if we're sitting in the jury box. We'll explore what the cameras outside could never capture, the full flow of testimony, the small moments that changed minds, and the reasons several jurors later said that, in their eyes, the evidence just wasn't there. You think you know the 2005 Michael Jackson trial? The arrest, the mugshot, the wall-to-wall commentary, the final walk out of that courthouse a free man. But until you step through those courtroom doors and see what the jury actually saw, you've only experienced the televised outline. Stay with me. By the end, you may not just rethink this trial. You may rethink how much of any historic case we really understand at all. The world's biggest star on trial. To understand what happened inside that courtroom in 2005, you first have to understand the pressure crushing everything outside it. This wasn't just another criminal case. This was Michael Jackson, one of the most famous entertainers on earth, walking into a quiet California courthouse under the weight of years of rumors, earlier accusations, and a media industry desperate for a definitive conclusion. The charges were devastating: child molestation, administering alcohol to a minor, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment and extortion. The alleged victim, Gavin Arvizo, was a young cancer survivor who had appeared with Jackson in public and on camera. Prosecutors framed the case as the unveiling of a predator who had hidden behind charity, celebrity, and money. Television focused on the most dramatic images: officers searching Neverland Ranch, Jackson arriving at court surrounded by fans, the surreal scenes of him waving to crowds before stepping inside. Commentators speculated about his finances, his health, his eccentricity. But for the jurors, stripped of cameras and commentary, one fact mattered above all. This was a criminal trial, and the burden was entirely on the state to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Inside the courtroom, things looked very different from the way they were packaged for broadcast. Cameras were not allowed to televise the proceedings. Viewers saw sketch artist drawings and reporters' summaries. They heard short quotes from attorneys speaking on the courthouse steps. The jury, by contrast, heard every word directly under oath for months. They received strict instructions: stay away from media coverage, ignore outside opinions, and base your decision only on what happens in this room. The prosecution's theory leaned heavily on a British documentary that had set everything in motion. A TV special in which Jackson admitted that children sometimes slept in his bed while he slept elsewhere in the room. That program sparked worldwide backlash and triggered the investigation that led to the formal charges. Clips from that interview were replayed endlessly on television. To many watching at home, those images themselves felt incriminating. But jurors weren't asked to decide whether Jackson's lifestyle was appropriate, or whether his behavior made people uncomfortable. They were asked something much more specific. Did the prosecution, through credible, consistent evidence, prove that he committed the alleged crimes against this particular boy, during the specific period described in the charges? Even before witnesses began to testify, the ground beneath the case was already complex. Early on, the boy and his mother had given interviews praising Jackson, calling him generous and caring. Those positive statements existed on tape. Later their story changed sharply. On TV, this shift was often framed as a victim finally revealing the truth. In the jury box it raised a narrower question. How do these versions line up and can they all be true? The court also allowed testimony touching on the family's past disputes and claims against others. For many television viewers, this background was barely mentioned or quickly summarized. For jurors, it became part of a broader picture. Who was this family? How had they handled conflict before, and could there be financial or personal motives mixed into their accusations? As opening statements ended, one thing was clear. This would not be a short, straightforward trial. Dozens of witnesses were set to appear: the accuser, his siblings, his mother, former Neverland employees, celebrities, law enforcement officers, medical experts, and more. On television, discussion of these witnesses tended to flatten into a binary: good for the prosecution, or good for the defense. Inside the courtroom, the story was far less black and white. Lives, relationships, personal histories, and conflicting memories all collided in unpredictable ways. What looked like a simple battle between guilt and innocence on TV was, for the jury, a slow, complicated search for something harder to find: enough certainty to justify ending a man's freedom. From the prosecution's perspective, the story was clear. A powerful star took advantage of a vulnerable boy. According to their case, the Arvizo family stayed overnight at Neverland. Jacskon gave the boy alcohol, Jesus juice, they said he called it, and then molested him on multiple occasions after those drinking sessions. For television, that narrative was explosive. The most disturbing claims, especially those describing nights in Jackson's bedroom, quickly became headline material. News programs highlighted emotional soundbites and short quotes that seemed to confirm the worst suspicions. To many people watching at home, the accusations felt like a single, coherent story marching toward inevitable conviction. The jury, however, saw not just the story but the entire process of trying to prove it. When the young accuser took the stand, he described meeting Jackson, admiring him, and eventually staying at Neverland. He detailed how, according to him, innocent sleepovers turned into something darker. But the defense's cross-examination forced him to walk back, clarify, or struggle with aspects of his timeline. Things he had said previously did not always match what he said on the stand. Dates shifted. Sequences of events didn't line up perfectly with earlier statements. On television, this was usually reduced to phrases like, "the defense challenged his credibility." That sounded minor. To the jurors, who heard every question and every hesitation, it was central. They weren't just deciding whether the boy seemed sympathetic. They were deciding whether his account, as a piece of evidence, was reliable enough to support a criminal conviction. Then there was his mother. In most TV portrayals, she appeared briefly as a determined parent seeking justice. Inside the courtroom, she became one of the most divisive witnesses in the whole case. On direct examination, she spoke about feeling controlled and isolated, claiming that members of Jackson's team tried to manage her movements, control her image, and push her into publicly defending him in a rebuttal video. She portrayed herself as a frightened mother, trapped in a situation far beyond her control. But under cross-examination, things changed. The defense confronted her with old statements, prior legal disputes, and inconsistencies in her story. At times, her answers wandered. At others, she clashed openly with the defense, giving the jury a very different impression than the one created by short, edited clips the public saw later. Several jurors would later say that her testimony severely damaged the prosecution's case. They described her as unreliable, even manipulative. That level of distrust never fully registered with the television audience, because viewers usually got only fragments, often the most emotional moments, not the ones where her story faltered. The prosecution also brought in law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and former Neverland staff to support its claims. They showed the jury adult material seized from Jackson's home, introduced evidence of alcohol on the property, and highlighted the elaborate layout of the bedroom area. On TV, these elements were frequently framed as ominous, suggesting a pattern of inappropriate behavior with boys. But inside the courtroom, the defense questioned each point. Were certain items truly tied to the allegations, or simply part of an eccentric adult's private life? Were timelines around key discoveries solid, or more ambiguous when examined closely? Defense attorneys suggested that some former employees had grudges, financial motives, or other reasons to cast Jackson in a negative light. Even details that sounded decisive in headlines looked different in person. Allegations about fingerprints on adult magazines or the exact placement of certain items were surrounded by questions about handling, access, and context. What played as a smoking gun in a short TV segment often felt far less definitive once jurors heard hours of technical questioning. By the time the prosecution rested, many commentators still spoke as though the case was strong. Some predicted guilty verdicts on at least some counts. But for jurors, the simple narrative had already started to fracture. They had seen too many gaps, too many contradictions, and too many pieces of evidence that looked less powerful under sustained scrutiny. And the defense was only beginning its effort to offer a completely different reading of the same events. When the defense began, much of the media treated it as a counterpunch, something to balance the prosecution's story. For the jury, it was deeper than that. It offered a different lens through which to view almost everything they had already heard. Lead defense attorney Thomas Mesereau made a deliberate choice. He didn't pretend Michael Jackson was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Instead, he acknowledged Jackson's unusual behavior and lifestyle, while separating those oddities from any proof of criminal intent. The message was consistent. Being strange is not the same thing as being guilty. The jury heard from people who had known Jackson for years, former employees, bodyguards, friends, and visitors. Many described him as emotionally childlike, obsessively focused on recreating a lost childhood, and at times painfully naive about how his actions could be interpreted. They also described extensive charity work, children brought to Neverland for fun, hospital visits, and quiet donations that never made headlines. On TV, those accounts were often compressed into short clips, sometimes overshadowed by more sensational testimony. In the jury box, they unfolded over hours, expanding the picture far beyond the caricature of Jackson as either pure monster or pure victim. One of the defense's most effective tools was the accuser's own past words. The jury watched the rebuttal video recorded after the controversial documentary aired, a tape in which the family praised Jackson, appeared relaxed around him, and defended his character. The prosecution said they were pressured into doing this and were afraid to speak out honestly at the time. The defense argued the video showed their true feelings before financial motives and outside influences took over. On television, that clash of interpretations was usually summarized in a line or two. The jurors, however, were left to sit with both versions and decide which felt more consistent with everything else they had seen. The defense also walked the jury through aspects of the family's history, previous complaints and legal actions against other parties, stories of conflicts that had ended with money changing hands or attempts to obtain benefits. The goal was not to put the family on trial for their past, but to raise a crucial question about this case. Was this pattern repeating? Then came witnesses who had, for years, been surrounded by rumors themselves, young men who, as boys, were once whispered about in connection with Jackson. Now adults, they took the stand and denied ever being abused. Critics later argued that loyalty or pressure might have influenced them. But to the jury, they were sworn witnesses, speaking directly and telling the court that nothing criminal had happened between them and Jackson. The defense also reframed physical details of Neverland. The prosecution had pointed to alarm systems and secluded areas as signs of secrecy. The defense argued these were security measures in a sprawling property, necessary for someone constantly targeted by intruders and stalkers. They acknowledged the existence of adult material in the house but stressed that it was legal and, by itself, proved nothing about crimes against minors. Again and again, the jury watched the same pieces of evidence being spun in opposite directions. Was a particular action proof of grooming, or simply bad judgment? Was a family seeking justice, or taking advantage of an opportunity? Those questions were not answered in sound bites. They were wrestled with slowly over weeks of conflicting testimony. By the time the defense rested, the simple prosecution narrative, powerful man, vulnerable child, inevitable conviction, had been seriously weakened in the eyes of many jurors. Doubt wasn't theoretical anymore. It was woven into nearly every major claim the state had made. When closing arguments ended and the case was finally handed to the jury, media outlets around the world shifted into a familiar posture: verdict watch. News vans stayed parked outside the courthouse. Commentators revisited the most dramatic testimony, replayed key clips from the documentary that started it all, and speculated endlessly about what the jury was thinking. Inside the deliberation room, things were far less theatrical. No cameras. No commentary. Just 12 people, their notes, the judge's instructions, and a stack of verdict forms. They weren't asked to decide whether Michael Jackson was strange, or whether his public image made them uneasy. They weren't asked to rule on rumors from the past. They were asked a narrow set of questions. Had the prosecution proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Jackson molested this boy, served him alcohol with criminal intent, and engaged in the alleged conspiracy? Jurors later described starting with the accuser's testimony. They went over his statements carefully, discussing where his story had remained stable and where it had shifted. Some admitted they initially felt he might be telling the truth. But as they matched his account against timelines, earlier interviews, and other witnesses, doubts grew. They spent significant time discussing his mother. For several jurors, her credibility problems were impossible to ignore. They noted how often her story changed and how combative she became under questioning. To them, she did not resemble the straightforward truth-teller that the prosecution had suggested the jury was hearing. Count by count, they examined the charges: molestation, giving alcohol, conspiracy. For each, they asked the same questions. Is the testimony consistent? Is it supported by independent evidence? Do we have documents, witnesses, or physical proof that solidly back this up? Or are we left with serious unanswered questions? Outside the courthouse, some commentators insisted that only celebrity could save Jacskon. Inside, jurors were having a very different discussion. Several later said that fame worked against him in their minds at first. They had arrived suspicious, influenced by years of headlines. What changed their thinking, they claimed, was not his status, but the state's inability to close the gaps in its own case. The jurors also recalled the defense's witnesses, former staff, longtime friends, and men who had once been rumored victims themselves. They weighed whether all of those people were lying, or whether the simpler explanation might be that the prosecution had not proven what it alleged. After roughly a week of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous decision: not guilty on every charge. On June 13, 2005, the world watched as Michael Jackson stood in that courtroom, tense and silent, while the clerk read the verdicts. One by one, the words "not guilty" echoed through the room. Outside, fans cried and celebrated. On television, commentators scrambled to explain how a case that had looked so overwhelming in nightly recaps had ended in total acquittal. Some called it vindication. Others saw it as proof the system had failed. Arguments erupted on talk shows and newspapers and later across the internet. Yet the people who had actually sat through every hour of the trial gave a simpler explanation: the evidence just didn't reach the legal standard required. For them, the verdict wasn't shocking. It was the only outcome the law allowed. In the years since, two competing realities have endured. One is the televised version of the trial, dramatic, simplified, built from snippets and commentary. The other is the quieter, far more complicated reality of what the jury experienced: flawed witnesses, conflicting motives, ambiguous evidence, and a mountain of reasonable doubt. The 2005 trial left us with more than a verdict about one man. It left us with a question about ourselves. When history is written through headlines and highlight reels, how often are we really seeing what the jury saw? And how often are we just watching the most dramatic edit? Now that you've walked back into that 2005 courtroom and looked at this case from the jury's perspective, it's your turn to weigh in. You've heard how different the story can look when you move beyond sound bites and slow the trial down to its real speed. When you listen to full testimonies, see contradictions exposed, and watch key witnesses in ways television never truly showed. You've seen how a case that seemed clear-cut from the outside could look very different in the only room that legally mattered. So, ask yourself, if you had been in that jury box, bound by the same rules and evidence, do you think you would have voted the same way? Do you feel the jury reached the correct legal decision, that the state simply did not prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt? Or do you still believe, despite the verdict, that justice wasn't served? Maybe this deep dive raised new questions for you about the media, about celebrity trials, and about how quickly we form opinions with incomplete information. I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. What surprised you most about what the jury actually saw? Did anything in this breakdown change how you remember the 2005 trial? And what does this case say, in your view, about the power and the limits of what we see on TV? If you want more documentary-style investigations into famous trials and the hidden details juries see that the public doesn't, subscribe and turn on notifications. Your comment, your like, and your subscription help keep this kind of long-form content alive.